Welcome back to the world of Ikard, where we learn how to think like the College Board. Today we're covering topics 9.4 and 9.5. Here's the required content for 9.4, Economics in the Global Age. First, this part about how governments encourage free market economic policies and economic liberalization. Free market policies and economic liberalization generally means less government ownership of industries and more private ownership, called privatization, the opposite of nationalization. It often includes lowering taxes on businesses and individuals, as well as deregulation, loosening the rules that apply to businesses. Let's look at some examples. First is Chile under Augusto Pinochet, who you know from 8.7 as a military dictator that intensified conflict, murdering and torturing political opponents. But he also implemented free market reforms, including privatizing industries, reducing taxes, and deregulating businesses. Pinochet's reforms brought substantial economic growth to Chile and promoted private business ownership, but not everyone benefited. Economic inequality also grew substantially. Now China under Deng Xiaoping, which embraced a policy known as reform and opening up, its own adaptation of free market reforms that still included substantial government involvement. It created special economic zones with lower taxes and less regulations to attract foreign investment, allowing foreign business while also stimulating local business. One of these zones was Shenzhen, which went from a small fishing village into what is now a huge city and major tech hub. It also allowed for more private ownership of businesses across the nation. The results were transformational. More than 800 million people were lifted out of poverty, and China is now the second largest economy in the world. Then there's also the UK under Margaret Thatcher and the United States under Ronald Reagan. Thatcherism and Reaganomics. Both cut taxes, reduced regulations, weakened labor unions, and reduced government spending, aside from Reagan's increase in military spending we saw in 8.8. Like other free market reforms, they resulted in both greater economic growth and greater inequality. This was a trend accelerated by the end of the Cold War. All of the former Eastern Bloc countries in Europe embraced free markets, including Russia under Boris Yeltsin, which implemented shock therapy, a sudden, immediate transition to free market capitalism. Even nations that remained communists adopted free market reforms, like we just saw in China. Vietnam also adopted a socialist-oriented market economy in the 1980s. This section is about two main things: knowledge economies and the shift in manufacturing to Latin America and Asia. Advances in information and communications technology include internet, cell phones, personal computers, and others. The industries involved in these high-tech items could generate huge amounts of wealth for the states where they were located. A good example is Silicon Valley in the United States, where Apple, Google, and many others are located. Japan is another example, known for being at the cutting edge of many technologies, with companies like Sony and Panasonic. Finland became known for telecommunications, notably Nokia, a big name for cell phones in the 1990s and early 2000s. These companies often do make things, computers, phones, gadgets, but their real product is information, the sophisticated knowledge of how these products work, and how to continually innovate more advanced tech. In fact, the actual manufacturing for these products was increasingly moved to Asia and Latin America. This is connected to the embrace of free market policies because most of the world was now participating in the global capitalist economy. China became the leading manufacturer and leading exporter, making it the factory of the world. Vietnam as well began its industrialization with textile manufacturing and has now become a major producer of electronics. Bangladesh is a leader in the textile industry. Mexico created maquiladoras, industrial centers where parts were imported, assembled, and then re-exported, especially to the United States, all without tariffs. The last section is about economic institutions, multinational corporations, and regional trade agreements. As the globalized economy became more complex and integrated in the late 20th century, economic institutions emerged to regulate trade and provide a formalized structure. The World Trade Organization, created in 1995, promotes free market principles like competition, elimination of tariffs, and open markets. Those who join the WTO are supposed to practice non-discrimination, not promoting or discriminating on products based on their own country of origin, including their own. Trade agreements are supposed to be transparent and predictable so that a level playing field can be achieved. The majority of nations in the world today are members of the WTO. There were also regional trade agreements that reflected free market principles. For example, NAFTA, which eliminated tariffs between the US, Canada, and Mexico. This led to an increase in trade among these nations and also facilitated the shift in manufacturing away from the US to Mexico in many industries, notably the automotive industry. All of this led to the proliferation of multinational corporations. Most of the big companies you can think of, Apple, Google, Toyota, Walmart, Amazon, are multinationals. They benefited from free market principles in many ways. Firstly, because it meant that they could sell their products to nations all over the world. They also benefited from the shift in manufacturing to Asia and Latin America because labor costs were lower and regulations tended to be looser. The corporations and shareholders of these companies benefited greatly, although industrial workers in the West suffered because of the loss of their jobs jobs overseas, a process called outsourcing. Now let's move on to topic 9.5, calls for reform and responses after 1900. Here's the required content. This section is about how rights-based discourses challenged old assumptions about race, class, gender, and religion. We first started talking about rights back in topic 5.1 when we discussed the Enlightenment. Now let's see how this continued into the 20th century and beyond, starting with the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It starts with the ideal of equal and inalienable rights for all members of the human family, a phrase clearly borrowed from the United States Declaration of Independence. All human beings are born free and equal in rights, which is borrowed from the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. But you should also know how it no longer says men, but says all members of the human family, showing how by the 20th century, women were being seen as more equal, a clear change from the 18th century revolutions. The Declaration also argues that these rights are without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or societal origin, property, birth, or social status. Article 16 guarantees women equality in marriage and the right to choose who they marry. Article 2 guarantees that the human rights also apply to refugees who have fled their country of origin, and Article 14 grants them the right to seek asylum from persecution. Article 25 guarantees children, whether born in or out of wedlock, the same social protection, and Article 26 guarantees children access to education. Just because members of the UN agreed to it didn't mean that these rights magically appeared for everyone, but it did represent a great expansion of the ideals of human rights. Then there were rights-based discourses that were more specific, for example, feminism. We first saw emergent feminism in 5.1 with thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft, Olympe de Gouges, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But we also saw how their achievements were limited. Full political equality in terms of voting rights would not come until the 20th century. In both the US and UK, the suffragettes were women who protested and advocated women's suffrage. We already mentioned how women's contribution to both world wars was a big factor in making this into a reality, but it was feminists like the suffragettes that pushed it through. Feminists also fought for reproductive rights, like Margaret Sanger, who built the first birth control clinic in the US in 1916. Reproductive rights activists also argued for access to abortion, which was declared protected in the US Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade in 1973, and then repealed in 2022. The Green Wave movement began in Argentina in 2003 and spread throughout Latin America, leading to legalized abortion in Argentina in 2020 and several other related changes throughout the region. Activists argue that reproductive rights are important for women to maintain autonomy over their own lives and bodies, and consider them to be essential human rights. Equal access to education had been argued for since Mary Wollstonecraft, and more recently the Malala Fund in 2013, which seeks to provide more access to girls around the world. There was also the Negritude movement, which began among French-speaking black intellectuals in the 1930s. This was about decolonization from a cultural perspective. It rejected the assumption inherent in the civilizing mission that African culture and international black culture was primitive. Instead, they celebrated the many cultural achievements of African Americans and the African diaspora throughout the centuries in music, art, and literature. Now this section. In much of the world, access to education, as well as participation in new political and professional roles, became more inclusive in terms of race, class, gender, and religion. In topic 8.7, we saw the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited school segregation based on race, racial discrimination for employment, and other forms of racial discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prevented discriminatory voting policies. In 8.7, we also saw how apartheid was finally ended in South Africa in 1994. Both of these were examples of nonviolent resistance resulting in greater legal equality. Access to education for women has made immense progress worldwide since the beginning of the 20th century. In many parts of the world, including Canada, the US, the UK, China, and many others, there are actually more women than men enrolled in universities. All around the world, women have gained the right to vote. Women first gained the right to vote in New Zealand in 1893, followed by Finland in Europe, Canada in North America, Brazil in South America, Japan in East Asia, and more recently, Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. Now this. Movements throughout the world protested the inequality of the environmental and economic consequences of global integration. For example, Greenpeace, which began in 1971, is known for protest against the use of fossil fuels and nuclear power, as well as deforestation and overfishing. They were also articulating the inequality of these environmental effects, that it was the richest countries who caused the most damage and benefited the most, while the poorest countries benefited least and suffered the most. The World Fair Trade Organization is another organization that protests unequal outcomes. One of the consequences of the globalized economy was what has been called a race to the bottom. The search among multinational multinational corporations for the lowest costs of labor. This leads to exploitative practices, including poor safety conditions and the use of child labor. The World Fair Trade Organization seeks to promote awareness of this and seeks to change the most exploitative practices. That's all for now. See you next time to wrap up globalization. Until then, keep thinking like the College Board.